It was a quiet afternoon in the city park, the kind of day where people came to relax, jog, or spend time with their families. Among them was James, a sharp-dressed black man sitting calmly on a bench, sipping coffee and reading a book. But to Officer Bradley, patrolling the area in his squad car, James didn't look like he belonged. Something about him made the officer suspicious, or so he claimed later. The cop pulled over, his eyes narrowing as he approached James. "Hey, you. What are you doing here?" Bradley demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. James looked up, confused but composed, and replied politely, "Just enjoying my afternoon." But his calmness seemed to agitate Bradley further. Within minutes, the situation escalated. Accusations flew. James tried to explain, but the officer wasn't interested in listening. Before long, handcuffs were slapped on James's wrists, and Bradley was dragging him toward the police car. That's when it happened. James looked the officer square in the eyes and said something that made Bradley freeze in his tracks. "You're making a big mistake. I'm a federal agent." The officer's face paled as the weight of those words sank in. But what came next was even more shocking. Officer Bradley hesitated for a moment, the weight of James's words hanging heavy in the air. "Federal agent," he repeated, a hint of doubt in his voice. He tried to regain his composure, tightening his grip on James's arm. "Nice try, but you're not getting out of this with some made-up story." James took a deep breath, his tone steady but firm. "I'm not making anything up. My credentials are in my wallet. If you'd bother to check before jumping to conclusions, you'd know that." Bradley scoffed, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The man in front of him didn't seem rattled, despite the cuffs and the situation. There was something about his confidence that didn't fit the officer's narrative. Nearby, a few parkgoers began to take notice, their quiet murmurs adding to the tension. A woman holding her child whispered, "What's going on?" while a jogger slowed down, glancing over his shoulder. Bradley felt their eyes on him, but instead of calming down, it fueled his frustration. He turned back to James, brushing off the crowd's growing interest. "You don't get to call the shots here. Let's see if your little story holds up at the station." James stayed calm, watching Bradley closely. "If you don't check my ID now, this is going to get a lot worse for you." His voice carried a quiet authority that made the officer pause again, but Bradley wasn't ready to back down. The tension was only beginning to rise. As Officer Bradley tightened his grip on James' arm, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling creeping up his spine. Something about this man didn't add up, and it wasn't the way Bradley had convinced himself earlier. Still, pride and years of acting on instinct made him push forward. "Let's go," he barked, leading James toward the squad car. Meanwhile, the murmurs from the parkgoers grew louder. A young man sitting on a nearby bench began recording the scene on his phone. "What's going on here?" he called out, his tone cautious but firm. Bradley shot him a glare. "Stay back. This is official police business." James glanced over his shoulder at the growing crowd, then turned back to Bradley. "You should know," he said, his voice calm but carrying a subtle edge. "Your actions here are already being documented." Bradley gritted his teeth, his frustration boiling over. "You think I care about a few bystanders with phones? You don't intimidate me." Back at the squad car, Bradley unlocked the back door and motioned for James to get inside. But before James could move, a second officer pulled up, lights flashing. Sergeant Monroe, a seasoned cop with years of experience, stepped out, looking puzzled. "What's going on here, Bradley?" Before Bradley could respond, James spoke up. "I'm Special Agent James Harper with the FBI. I've been wrongfully detained." Monroe froze for a moment, his sharp eyes darting between the two men. The weight of the situation was starting to shift, but no one knew yet how far it would go. Sergeant Monroe's gaze locked onto James. The mention of the FBI had clearly rattled him, but he kept his expression neutral. "Is this true?" Monroe asked, his voice low and deliberate. Bradley crossed his arms, shaking his head. "Don't listen to him. He's just saying whatever he can to get out of trouble. James stayed calm, though his patience was clearly thinning. "Check my wallet," he said, his voice steady. "It's in my pocket. Everything you need to know is right there." Monroe hesitated, glancing at Bradley, who looked increasingly defensive. "You really want to ignore this?" James added, his tone sharp. "I'm telling you, this will not end well for you." By now, the small crowd had grown larger. Some people whispered amongst themselves, others filmed on their phones, their curiosity and unease filling the air. The pressure was mounting. Monroe finally stepped forward, nodding toward Bradley. "Search him. If he's lying, we'll deal with it. But if he's telling the truth..." His voice trailed off, leaving the warning unspoken. Reluctantly, Bradley reached into James's pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet. He'd opened it, his eyes scanning the badge inside. Suddenly, his face drained of color. The words Federal Bureau of Investigation stared back at him, along with James's photo and credentials. Monroe stepped closer, taking the wallet from Bradley's trembling hands. His face hardened as he examined it. "This is legitimate," he said coldly. The crowd, sensing the shift, grew silent. James straightened his shoulders, his composure unshaken. "I told you," he said quietly, but his words carried weight. Bradley took a step back, his confidence crumbling. He was acting suspicious," he stammered, but Monroe cut him off. "Enough," he said, his voice sharp. "We're not done here, officer." The tension was palpable, and everyone could feel it, the moment just before everything came crashing down. Monroe handed the wallet back to James, his expression unreadable. "Agent Harper," he said carefully, "I apologize for this misunderstanding. Let's talk through this properly." But before James could respond, a voice crackled through Bradley's radio, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Unit 12, we've received a call about suspicious activity at the park involving a known fugitive. Description matches a male subject in a dark suit. Proceed with caution." The crowd murmured in confusion, and Bradley's eyes widened. "See, I wasn't wrong," he blurted, grabbing onto the sudden lifeline. "This guy could be dangerous. That's why I stepped in." Monroe raised a hand to silence him. "And yet, he has federal credentials," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "You still haven't explained why you escalated this without verification." James, meanwhile, frowned, his demeanor shifting slightly. "That radio call. Something's off," he said, his voice calm but sharp. He turned to Monroe. "That's not a coincidence. Someone's trying to muddy the waters here." Before Monroe could respond, a black SUV screeched to a halt near the park entrance. The doors flew open, and two men in plainclothes stepped out, flashing badges. "Special Agents Daniels and Cruz, FBI," one of them announced. Their eyes zeroed in on James. "Agent Harper, we need to speak with you. Now." The crowd shifted uneasily, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Bradley, still grasping for control, stepped back, his face pale. Monroe's jaw tightened as he looked at James. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice low. James turned to the agents, his face calm but his eyes calculating. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Daniels and Cruz exchanged a glance, and the air seemed to thrum with unspoken tension. The situation had just taken a dangerous new turn, and no one knew who to trust. James faced the two agents, his expression calm but his body tense, ready for anything. "Daniels, Cruz," he said evenly. "Care to explain why I'm being dragged into this circus?" Daniels stepped forward, his tone clipped. "We've been tracking a leak inside the Bureau, someone feeding intel to external parties. You were flagged as a potential target, or worse, a suspect. We needed to act fast." Cruz nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "The call to the local precinct wasn't authorized by us. Someone's trying to use this situation to cover their tracks." The words hit like a thunderclap, and Monroe's face darkened as he processed what was happening. James took a slow breath, his mind racing. "You think this was staged to discredit me?" he'd asked. Daniels nodded grimly. "Or worse. If they thought they could pin this on you, it buys them time to slip away unnoticed." Bradley, who had been silent until now, took a cautious step back. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know," he stammered, but his nervous demeanor made James snap his attention to him. "Did you get a call before this? Anything unusual?" James asked sharply. Bradley hesitated, then nodded. "There was. Someone said to keep an eye out for trouble here, but they didn't give a name." James' expression hardened. "You were set up, just like me." Turning to Monroe, he added, "And now it's clear someone wanted this chaos to distract us." Just then, Cross's radio buzzed with urgency. "Agents, we've identified a vehicle leaving the area. Possible suspect heading eastbound. Instructions." Cruz exchanged a look with Daniels before nodding to James. "Harper, you coming with us? We could use your insight." James didn't hesitate. "Let's go." He turned to Monroe. "I suggest you keep Officer Bradley under watch until we figure out exactly how deep this goes." As the agents rushed back to their SUV, the crowd began to disperse, though a few lingered still recording. James climbed into the vehicle, his mind still racing. As they sped off, he glanced at Cruz. "If this was meant to take me out of play, we're closer than we thought, aren't we?" Cruz gave a tight smile. "Closer than they'll ever realize." But as the SUV disappeared into the distance, Bradley stood frozen at the park, his radio buzzing faintly with static. A voice crackled through, low and sinister. "The plan failed. We'll need to try again." He fumbled with the radio, his heart pounding. No one else heard it, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. As the SUV sped through the city streets, James couldn't help but reflect on how quickly things had spiraled. What started as a quiet afternoon in the park had turned into a dangerous game of deception. The pieces were falling into place now. Someone on the inside was orchestrating this chaos, trying to throw the Bureau off their trail. But whoever they were, they had underestimated him. Back at the park, Sergeant Monroe kept a watchful eye on Officer Bradley, who looked more shaken than ever. Monroe's suspicions grew as he replayed the events in his mind. Bradley wasn't just a pawn, he might have known more than he let on. "We'll be having a long conversation," Monroe muttered, his tone firm. Meanwhile, James and the agents followed the lead on the fleeing vehicle. It eventually led them to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Though the suspects were gone, they found critical evidence, documents linking them all to several high-profile leaks. The case wasn't over, but they were closer than ever to the truth. As the sun set, James finally let himself exhale. Justice wasn't always swift, but it was inevitable. Walking back to his car, he looked out over the city, resolved. They'll slip up again, he thought, and when they did, he'd be ready.